My parents disowned me. Now they're begging me to save them. But I took them to court instead, and then. I was 17 the last time I heard my father call me his son, and it wasn't out of love. It was through clenched teeth, with spit flying from his mouth, his hands shaking as he shouted at me to leave his house and never come back. His exact words carved themselves into my memory with the kind of precision only betrayal can achieve. Get out of my sight. I don't have a child like you. All I had done was ask about the money my grandfather left behind when he passed. Money that had been explicitly meant for me and my twin brother, split down the middle, no ambiguity in the wording of the will. But in our house, fairness had always been a theory, never something practiced. 12 hours earlier, I had placed my acceptance letter on the kitchen counter with a kind of nervous pride I hadn't felt in years. Lakeshore Institute of Technology wasn't just a college. It was the culmination of 3 years spent working after school in the computer lab, teaching myself to code when other kids were out at parties, and applying to every scholarship under the sun because I knew my parents wouldn't lift a finger to help. I had gotten in on a full ride, covering tuition and fees, but I still needed a laptop, equipment, and money for food and housing. So, I did the logical thing. I asked for access to my share of the inheritance my grandfather had left us when he died of a heart attack just before my 16th birthday. My grandfather, Henry, had been the only person in the family who treated me like I wasn't invisible. He never compared me to Miles, never said things like, "Why can't you be more like your brother?" and never made me feel like I was taking up space that didn't belong to me. He just loved us, quietly, simply, like it was the most natural thing in the world. A month after his funeral, the family gathered at his house for the reading of the will, and I remember sitting there next to my mom, clutching my knees to keep them from shaking. When the lawyer read the line about the $180,000 being left in equal parts for Miles and me, I looked down, swallowed hard, and felt, for the first time in a long time, like maybe I wouldn't have to claw my way through life completely alone. But the money had to be held in trust until we turned 18, and that trust was under the names of my parents, Martin and Clara. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I just assumed they'd release it to us when the time came, no questions asked. That was the last time I believed anything about them worked on good faith. When I asked to access the funds, my father barely looked up from his chair. He gave a half snort, like I'd asked for a vacation to the moon, and then said something that made my stomach drop. That money's going to Miles. We already decided. I couldn't tell if my heart was racing or if everything had just stopped completely. I looked at my mom, hoping she'd say something, anything, but she just turned back to the sink, pretending not to hear. That was her way. Silence was her armor, and it had protected her through every cruel word my father had ever thrown. I said, clearly and without raising my voice, "Grandpa left that money for both of us." The will said it was to be split. My father's eyes narrowed as if I'd insulted him. "You got a scholarship," he said, leaning forward. "Miles didn't. He needs it more." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. So the reward for working hard is getting nothing, and the reward for needing help is taking everything? He slammed his fist against the table. That's enough. Family means making sacrifices. I looked him dead in the eye and said, "I've sacrificed my entire childhood. All I'm asking is for what was promised to me." That was when he stood, pointed toward the door, and delivered the sentence that would define everything after. "Get out of my sight. I don't have a child like you." I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I stood still for a few seconds, trying to decide whether I was dreaming or just too stunned to react. Then I walked to my room, packed a backpack with the few things I truly cared about, and left. But I didn't go far. I biked to my Uncle Franklin's house, just a few miles down the road, my hands frozen around the handlebars, my throat tight enough to choke on. Franklin was outside, watering his garden, and when he saw me, he didn't say anything at first. He just looked at me, nodded, and said, "Come inside." We sat in his kitchen, and I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, didn't blink when I said my father had cut me off. He just sat there, nodding occasionally, until I finished. Then he stood and said, "Wait here." He returned to my parents' house later that day and demanded a conversation. I wasn't there, but I know how it went. I saw the look in his eyes when he came back. He was calm, but there was a fire behind his expression, controlled, but undeniable. He handed me 2 bags. "They're yours," he said. "You're staying here from now on." He told his kids to give me their room. No one complained. That night, I laid in a bed that wasn't mine, in a room that wasn't mine, and yet I had never felt more like I belonged. I didn't cry. I didn't mourn. I just stared at the ceiling and thought, this is the end of one life and the start of another. And from that moment on, I was no longer someone's son or someone's brother. I was just Julian, and I would build everything on my own. There's something strange about learning to live without the people who raised you. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens in quiet pieces, like shedding a skin you didn't realize was choking you until it's gone. I stayed at Uncle Franklin's house for 4 months before I moved into the dorms at Lakeshore, and during that time, I didn't call my parents, didn't text Miles, didn't even walk past their street. It was easier to pretend they didn't exist than to face the truth that they didn't care whether I did. College was brutal in every way I expected and a few ways I didn't. I worked nights at the campus library, early mornings in the computer lab, and weekends assisting professors with research just to scrape together enough for food, books, and whatever busted piece of hardware I could afford from the secondhand tech store 3 blocks off campus. While most students used their free time to party or join clubs, I was splitting my days between lectures, debugging ancient code, and wondering if the vending machine coffee would be strong enough to keep me awake through a midnight shift. But I never asked anyone for help. Not once. I didn't want to owe anyone anything, especially not people who would hold it over me like some kind of debt. I'd rather go hungry than hear someone say I was lucky to be where I was. Luck had nothing to do with it. Discipline did. Desperation did. Rage did. I graduated 3.5 years later with a degree in computer science and a GPA just shy of perfect. On the day of the ceremony, I looked out into the crowd and didn't see my parents' faces. But I saw Franklin standing in the back, arms folded, wearing the same jacket he always wore to weddings and funerals. Beside him were his 2 kids, holding a homemade sign that read, "You did it, Julian," in big blue marker letters that shook a little at the edges. That was enough. That was more than I ever expected. The next 3 years after college were nothing like the movies. There was no sudden explosion of success, no flashy office with glass walls and free snacks. I started as a junior developer at a mid-sized software firm that built data protection software for small clinics and insurance firms. It was boring work, soul-numbing, repetitive, dry as cardboard, but it paid $48,000 a year, and that was all I needed. I rented a tiny 1-bedroom in the northwest corner of the city, commuted by train, cooked whatever I could microwave, and learned the difference between surviving and living. While others in my field used connections to land better roles, I stayed where I was, slowly grinding my way through the ranks, taking on every task no one else wanted. I rewrote thousands of lines of broken code, debugged systems that hadn't been updated since the Bush administration, and documented every fix like my life depended on it. Because it did. Because my only shot at moving forward was proving, over and over again, that I belonged there. By the end of my second year, my salary crept up to $61,000. By the third, it hit $74,000. It wasn't much, not by industry standards, but I made it stretch. I took freelance work on the side, small gigs for startups that needed APIs built or back-end systems tested, and worked until my eyes stung. I still didn't party, didn't date, didn't waste energy on anything that might slow me down. There were nights I barely slept, and there were mornings I questioned why I was even bothering when I could barely afford rent. But every time I thought about quitting, I thought about the night I was thrown out of my own home. I thought about the silence that followed. I thought about Miles sitting at my old desk, probably using the laptop that money bought him, living in a house that pretended I never existed. And that kept me moving. The only person who checked in regularly was Franklin. He never asked how much I was making or what I planned to do next. He just texted every other Sunday to ask if I was coming by for dinner. And I always did, even if I only stayed an hour, even if we didn't talk about anything that mattered. It was enough to be seen without being judged. For years after college, everything shifted. It started like any other side gig, Just another contract from a no-name startup with a website that barely worked and an email signature that looked like it had been typed by a high schooler. But then I met Monica, the CTO. She was older than me by at least 15 years and had more experience in product development than most of the people I'd ever worked with combined. I expected to code quietly and cash a small check. I didn't expect her to notice the way I structured backend flow or how I managed project coordination without anyone asking. One night, after we fixed a problem that had stalled their prototype for weeks, she looked at me across the table and said, "You've got the kind of clarity that can't be taught. You ever think about building something of your own?" I laughed. I thought she was joking. She wasn't. 2 weeks later, she sent me a proposal. No fluff, no pitch deck, just an outline, a rough budget, and one line at the end. "If you want in, say yes." I said yes. Not because I believed we'd build anything world-changing, but because I was tired of being another cog in someone else's machine. We started in a converted storage room behind a dry cleaner on the south side. The AC rattled when it worked, and the Wi-Fi cut out if the microwave was on. But it was ours. We named the company Sintra, short for Sentinel, because we were building early AI systems to detect anomalies in medical imaging, starting with X-rays and chest scans. Monica handled the external chaos, investors, grants, pitching the product, while I took the back-end apart piece by piece until it ran the way it needed to. We worked 18-hour days without complaint. I slept in the office more than once. We didn't make a single cent the first 6 months, but then we signed our first clinic. A month later, another. By the end of the first year, a seed investor wrote us a check with 5 zeros. I didn't tell anyone. I just texted Franklin, "It's happening." He replied, "Good. Keep going." We hired our first engineers, rented real office space with heat that worked, and launched version 2.0 of our diagnostic suite. And through it all, I never looked back. I never wondered what my parents thought. I never asked if Miles was still in school or if he ever looked for me online. I just worked, because that was the only thing that ever made sense. I thought the past was dead, buried under years of silence and the concrete I'd poured into every line of code and sleepless night I survived to build a life without them. For over a decade, I hadn't heard a single word from my parents or from Miles. Not a message, not a call, not even a forwarded holiday email that was probably sent to every name in some old family contact list. I had come to accept, with time, that they'd erased me from their lives with the same finality my father used when he screamed I was no longer his child. But the thing about ghosts is they don't stay buried, not when they think they can benefit from your resurrection. It started quietly, the way most storms do. A journalist I knew casually from a tech conference reached out and asked if I'd be willing to speak for a feature piece. The story was about founders who came from nowhere, who built something out of nothing. No family connections, no financial backing, no legacy doors held open just because of a last name. I hesitated, as I always did, because I wasn't interested in being anyone's inspiration or poster boy for bootstrap success. But something in me shifted that day. Maybe I thought I was finally far enough from it all that telling even a fraction of the truth wouldn't hurt. So I said yes. The interview was short. I kept it professional. I never named names. I didn't describe the fight, the inheritance, the nights I spent alone staring at ceilings I didn't recognize. I just said I'd been disowned at 17, that I'd been taken in by an uncle who asked for nothing in return, and that I'd worked 3 jobs during college to get here. 2 days later, the article dropped. The headline was clean. The tone was respectful. I skimmed it once, turned off notifications, and got back to work. Then, out of nowhere, a number I didn't recognize lit up my phone one afternoon while I was walking out of a client meeting. I wouldn't have answered it if I hadn't been distracted, if my guard hadn't been lowered for just that split second. But I did. And the moment I heard her voice, it all came rushing back like I'd been sucker punched by time itself. "Julian," she said, and the silence that followed held years of things unsaid. I didn't speak at first. I couldn't tell if my heart was racing from anger or just the shock of hearing my mother's voice again after all this time. She spoke again, this time with a hint of tremble, like she didn't know which version of me she was about to face. "I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but things have gotten hard, really hard. Your father's been sick for months, bedridden, and Miles is barely getting by. We didn't know what else to do. I don't know what I expected to feel. Rage, maybe, or pity. But what settled over me was colder than either. I said, calmly, I haven't been a part of that family in almost 15 years. You made sure of that. She tried to plead again, tried to twist the knife with phrases like, we're still your blood, and family sticks together, but I stopped her before she could finish. You weren't there when I needed you. Not once. And now that you need something, you remember I exist? Then I hung up. I didn't wait for her to respond. I didn't give her the power to reframe it. I walked to the end of the block, leaned against a light pole, and just breathed. Later that night, I called Franklin. He picked up before the second ring, like he already knew something had happened. I told him everything. Her voice, her words, the strange lack of emotion I felt during it all. And when I said I told her no, he didn't pause. He just said, you did the right thing. You have every right to protect yourself from the people who hurt you, even if they're the ones who gave you life. I thought that would be the end of it. I thought saying no would be enough. But I should have remembered what kind of people they really were. 1 week later, everything exploded. A friend from the industry sent me a short message with a link. You need to see this right now. It was a public post. The name on it made my stomach drop. Miles, my twin brother, who hadn't said a word to me in almost 15 years, had written an open letter for the world to see. I'm Miles, it began, twin brother of Julian, the man everyone's praising as a self-made visionary. But here's what you don't know. The post was filled with carefully crafted half-truths and outright lies, stories about our sick father, our struggling mother, and a brother who had turned his back on all of us the moment he got rich. He said I abandoned my family while they were drowning, that I had the means to help and chose silence instead. He painted himself as the dutiful son who stayed behind to carry the weight, and me as the cold-hearted success story who walked away with no remorse. It spread like wildfire. Within hours, blogs picked it up. Some of our investors started emailing. My head of PR asked if we should respond. Rumors swirled. Words like inhumane and selfish started appearing next to my name on social media. No one asked for my side. No one questioned the narrative. Because the truth doesn't matter when a tragedy makes better headlines. I was furious. Not because they were trying to hurt me. They already had, years ago, but because they were trying to destroy what I'd built. They weren't just attacking me. They were attacking Centra. They were endangering every employee, every partnership, every ounce of trust we'd earned over the years. We called an emergency board meeting. I sat in a room surrounded by people who had trusted me with their careers, their time, their belief in something bigger than themselves. I could feel their questions hanging in the air, even if no one spoke them aloud. And for the first time in years, I felt something close to helpless. Then my phone buzzed again. It was Franklin. I stepped out into the hall and answered. You've seen it? I asked. His voice was steady, unwavering. Yes, he said. But don't panic. I'm on my way. There's something I kept all these years. Something I never thought we'd need. But now it's time. I didn't understand what he meant. He wouldn't explain. He just said, be ready. I'll be there in an hour. Then he hung up. When he arrived, everything changed. When Franklin walked through the doors of the office, he didn't look like someone trying to rescue me. He looked like someone who had planned for this moment a long time ago and was only waiting for it to arrive. He held a leather folder under his arm, worn at the corners and slightly curved with age, like it had been moved 100 times but never opened. I didn't say a word when I met him in the lobby. I just nodded, turned, and led him into the boardroom, where the legal and communications teams were waiting. Inside, the room was tense but silent, with my lead counsel sitting straight back beside the head of investor relations, both of them scanning every social feed for the next piece of fallout. Franklin walked to the end of the table without a word, set the folder down, and slowly opened it. The first thing he pulled out was a printed, notarized copy of my grandfather's will. The original document from 15 years ago, with my name and Miles's printed in ink clear as daylight. The lawyer who had handled my grandfather's estate had retired a decade earlier, but the stamp on the bottom was still legally valid, and the inheritance amount was listed clearly, $180,000 to be split evenly between his two grandsons, held in trust until their 18th birthday. I didn't realize how badly I'd needed to see that page again until it was in front of me. Undeniable proof that I hadn't made any of it up, that the money had been mine all along, and not some selfish fantasy I'd clung to just to justify the years of bitterness that followed. But that wasn't the document that changed everything. That wasn't the reason the silence in the room cracked into disbelief. The second page Franklin laid down was sealed in a thin plastic sleeve, yellowed slightly at the edges, the ink still perfectly legible, the header printed in thick black letters. Voluntary relinquishment of parental rights. He looked at me briefly, then turned to the others as my legal counsel leaned in to read. The day Julian left home, Franklin said, his parents signed this document. They declared, in writing, that they were severing all emotional, legal, and financial ties with him from that day forward. They signed it without hesitation. I watched them do it. No one spoke, but I could feel the shift in the room, the weight that had been pressing down on all of us slowly peeling back, like the walls themselves had been holding their breath. My attorney stood and took the document, scanning the contents quickly before setting it flat on the table for everyone to see. "This changes everything," she said, her voice louder than it needed to be. "They can't accuse Julian of abandonment when they legally disowned him. This is signed, dated, and witnessed. This is ironclad." I didn't move. I couldn't. I just sat there, staring at the paper like it was a ghost I never expected to see again. It was surreal. Proof that I hadn't imagined the finality of that night. Proof that the door really had been closed on me with intention and permanence. Franklin sat beside me, without saying anything further, and the legal team sprang into action. They spent the rest of the afternoon preparing a formal response, a combination of a legal threat and a public release. The defamation suit was already in motion, but now they had evidence to support every claim. Our communications team drafted a statement outlining the facts, supported by images of the two documents, the will and the disownment letter. No emotion, no spin, just the truth. We posted it on all official company channels first. Then we sent it directly to every media outlet that had picked up the story. And then we waited. I didn't have to wait long. Within an hour, the tide began to turn. Headlines that once condemned me began to disappear or change their tone. Family feud escalates amid legal evidence, replaced tech CEO abandons sick father. Social media, as always, responded instantly. Some people apologized, most just pivoted to confusion, but the judgment softened, the attack slowed, and by the end of the day, Miles deleted his post entirely without saying a word. But that wasn't the end. Not for them. Not for me. We served a formal defamation complaint to Miles and his attorney, listing reputational damages, emotional distress, and interference with corporate contracts. The initial figure was just over $1 million. A separate cease and desist was delivered to my parents, citing their public comments in support of the original post, and legally barring them from referencing me or Sintra in any future public or private statement without consent. They tried to call again. This time, my mother used a different number, probably borrowed from a neighbor or one of her coworkers. When I answered, her voice was ice. "So now you're suing your brother?" she snapped, her tone no longer soft, no longer trembling. "This is what you've become? We gave you life, and now you're dragging us through court like strangers." I didn't shout. I didn't argue. I said only one thing before I hung up for good. "You gave me life, and then you signed it away. Don't call me again." 3 days later, they showed up at my office. I was in a meeting when I got the call from security. "There are 3 individuals outside the building holding signs. They say they're your family and are demanding to speak with you." When I checked the camera feed, I saw them, my mother, my father, and Miles, standing at the front entrance with handwritten signs that said things like, "Family deserves forgiveness," and "Talk to us, Julian." At first, they just stood there. Then they knelt. On the pavement, in front of a dozen employees and pedestrians. I watched from the top floor, standing behind the tinted window of the executive lounge, and I didn't move. I didn't send anyone down. I didn't call to tell them to stop. Because I needed them to understand something. They had spent 15 years pretending I didn't exist, and now that I had something to lose, they were trying to claw their way back into relevance. But it was too late. I called security and asked them to step in. When they refused to leave, the police were contacted, and they were escorted off the premises. I didn't watch them go. I turned away before the squad cars even pulled up. 3 months later, the court date arrived. Miles showed up with his lawyer and didn't look at me once. My parents sat behind him, stone-faced and expressionless, as if they'd been dragged there against their will. The trial lasted 2 days. Our side presented everything: the will, the disownment, the social media fallout, the canceled contracts, the internal reports. No embellishment, just facts. Their side had nothing. No signed agreements. No record of contact. Just a vague argument about moral obligation that fell apart under the weight of legal clarity. The ruling came down quickly. Miles was ordered to pay $1.3 million in damages. My parents were required to issue a public written apology and were legally barred from speaking about me, my name, or my company in any capacity. Any violation would result in criminal contempt. I left the courthouse without a single word. Not to them. Not to the press. Not even to the crowd outside. The chapter was finally closed, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like justice, quiet, necessary, and years overdue. When it was over, I didn't feel lighter or freer or triumphant in the way people might imagine after winning a legal battle that rewrites the story the world had already decided to tell for you. I just felt still, like the noise had finally stopped, like I could breathe again without looking over my shoulder for a past that used to chase me every time I took a step forward. The judgment was public, the apology was posted, and the damage had been measured in words and dollars. But none of that changed the truth that I had lived with long before any of them decided to come crawling back into my life with desperation disguised as remorse. Centra recovered faster than I expected. In the weeks after the ruling, the messages from clients and partners started shifting from cautious concern to quiet congratulations. A few investors who had frozen talks reopened negotiations, now more respectful than before. My leadership team never asked for explanations. They'd seen the evidence. They'd watched me walk through the fire and come out the other side without burning the company down. In the tech world, reputation can shatter overnight, but if you survive the storm, people treat you like you're made of iron. The only person I spoke to freely during that time was Franklin. One night, after everything had settled, I visited him at his house and found him in the garage, standing over a workbench with a busted lamp he was trying to fix. I brought dinner, set it on the table, and leaned against the wall. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't ask what came next. He just handed me a screwdriver and said, "Hold this while I tighten the base." That was always his way, offering presence instead of pressure, support instead of solutions. After we finished eating, I turned to him and said, "I think it's finally over." He looked at me for a second, nodded once, and replied, "Good. Then you can stop surviving and start living." And I did. I focused on the work again, not because I had something to prove, but because I finally didn't. We expanded into 3 more cities, signed contracts with 2 hospital networks, and launched our newest diagnostic suite. We moved into a proper office with windows that didn't rattle, a real kitchen, and enough space for a proper team to grow. I didn't furnish my office with anything flashy. I still used the same worn notebook I'd carried since my first freelance job, and I still sat with my engineers late at night during product pushes, not because I had to, but because I wanted them to know they weren't alone in the work. Somewhere along the way, life became something more than just escape. I started going out on weekends, sometimes with the team, sometimes just alone, walking along the lakefront with no destination. I joined a gym, not to chase aesthetics, but to take care of a body I had ignored for too long. I started eating like I deserved to be healthy, started sleeping without waking up in cold sweats from dreams about being 17 again, standing outside with nothing but a backpack and nowhere to go. And then, slowly, I let someone in. Her name was Noelle. We met at a cybersecurity roundtable hosted by a nonprofit I'd done some quiet consulting for. She wasn't in tech. She worked in public health policy, but she asked smart questions, not because she wanted to be impressed, but because she actually wanted to understand. Our first conversation wasn't romantic. It was curious, thoughtful, like two people testing the edges of something neither of us was trying to rush. I didn't tell her everything at first. I didn't talk about my parents or Miles or the lawsuit that still had its own folder in the news archives. I just told her I built things that helped people and that I was still learning how to be proud of that. She didn't push. She didn't need to. She showed up. And after a while, so did I. One night, months into knowing her, we sat on the floor of my apartment with takeout containers between us, and I told her the full story. Every part of it. Not because I wanted her to fix anything, but because I wanted her to see the foundation I was built on. When I finished, she didn't ask why I hadn't cut them off sooner or why I didn't just move on without making it public. She just said, "That must have been hell to carry by yourself." And I nodded, because it had been. But it wasn't anymore. I don't know what will happen next. I don't have some grand vision of revenge turning into redemption or pain becoming legacy. I just know that I have space now, real, quiet space, to choose what comes next without the past reaching through every window I try to open. Once, a long time ago, I thought family was something permanent, something fixed and untouchable no matter how much it hurt. But now I understand that family is defined by presence, not biology, by who stays when the roof collapses, not who shared your last name on a legal document. My family is Franklin, who never asked for thanks and never accepted repayment. It's the engineers who stuck with me through every product delay and PR storm. It's the people who believed me when it mattered most, not because I had a name or a following, but because I had the truth. As for the ones who tried to destroy me, I wish them nothing. No hatred, no vengeance, no forgiveness they haven't earned. Just distance, silence, closure. They taught me how dangerous love can be when it's laced with control, and how healing doesn't always come from reconnection. It sometimes comes from finality. So if you're reading this and wondering if I ever regret walking away, the answer is no. Not even for a second. Because walking away gave me a chance to build something that couldn't be taken, to write a story no one else could rewrite behind my back. And maybe that's all any of us are trying to do in the end. Build something stronger than what broke us, even if it takes years and scars and legal battles to get there. You asked if I was wrong for turning my back on the people who gave me life. But the truth is, they turned theirs first. And I just learned how to stop looking back.